Okay, our first term is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is also known as Pavlovian conditioning or associative learning. It was discovered by a Russian psychologist named Ivan Pavlov, who was doing experiments in laboratories on salivary responses in dogs. And he noticed that the presence of the researchers in the room was affecting his experiments. And so he set up an automated feeding system in order to feed the dogs with the researchers not present. And so a bell would signal the delivery of food, and food would be dispensed by automatic feeders. And the bell, which was previously a neutral signal to a dog, meant nothing to the dogs, through predicting food, came to prompt the same response in the dogs that food did. So bell, food, repeatedly until the dogs were responding to the bell by salivating in the same way that we would actually respond to food. And he called this classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is at work all the time in dog training. We use it deliberately in certain aspects of our training to condition our markers, which are part of our communication system that we'll talk about shortly, and to condition dogs to certain stimuli in the environment as well. And then it's happening whether we want to or not. Anytime we're repeatedly exposing the dog to a neutral stimuli that predicts a meaningful stimuli, classical conditioning can occur. Some of the important things we need to remember about classical conditioning as it applies to dog training is that Pavlov discovered that if the neutral stimuli was presented at the same time as the reward or the food, what we call the primary reinforcer in this case, then no classical conditioning happened. Or if the neutral stimuli was presented while the dog was eating the food, there was no classical conditioning. In order for it to happen, it had to predict the production. It had to happen right before. And so keep this in mind. This is a concept that we're going to come back to extensively in this DVD. The sound or the neutral stimuli must precede the meaningful stimuli, the primary reinforcer. Another thing we want to keep in mind about classical conditioning is that after classical conditioning occurs, after it has been achieved, the response, the internal response in the dog, is involuntary. And this is going to be very important. We'll come back to this later, but I want people to understand that the dog's response to classical conditioning is not a choice. It's an involuntary response.